Alright, we're going to start a new unit on atomic theory. Now, lesson number 1 is going to be atomic theory, history of it. Now, the big idea here is the atomic theory was developed and redeveloped as science progressed throughout history. Now, we're going to go into a little review lesson on how the atom came to be known as the way it looks today. Now, before we all get started on these famous scientists, we're going to talk about Jimmy Neutron. Now, Jimmy Neutron, I remember watching this TV show as a kid. If you don't remember Jimmy Neutron yourself, this is what Jimmy Neutron looked like. Now, why I'm bringing up Jimmy Neutron is because he was a boy scientist, like myself, sort of. But one of the important things is his logo on his T-shirt was an atom. Now, that is actually an example of a specific model of what the atom looked like. So that's an example that some people know as the atom. Now, Jimmy Neutron was one of the first places where people probably spotted what an atom looks like. They never knew what it was, but that was the case. So we're going to talk about these different scientists and what they discovered, the analogy we have, and what their diagram looks like. So let's start off with Democritus. Democritus was a philosopher about 2,400 years ago, and he started the idea of what an atom was. Now, he philosophized this. He didn't actually have experiments. He thought about it and said, there must be these small little things, and they must be called atoms. There were no analogies for this, and there were no real pictures for this, because this was still a theory, a thing that he thought of. Now, about 100 years after Democritus or so, along came another philosopher, Aristotle. Aristotle said, no, there is no such thing as there are no such thing as atoms. There are instead 4 elements. And he called that these 4 elements were earth, fire, wind, and water. And again, there are no analogies or pictures. And again, this was 2,300 years ago, and a lot of people believed in Aristotle. Now, there's many reasons for that. One of the big things is these 4 elements can be seen. Earth, fire, wind, water can be seen. Atoms cannot. Another thing is just that Aristotle was associated with way more powerful people in the Greek Empire at the time with Alexander the Great. Another TV show that came out in the 1980s or so, late 80s, talked about these 4 elements, and it was called Captain Planet, where these Planeteers had to combine the power of fire, wind, earth, and water, as well as heart, to summon Captain Planet, who's going to save the planet from environmental disasters. So that's another place that students or people back in the day would have came across, in this case, Aristotle's idea. But we have to really go and fast forward to about maybe around 2,000 years or so after Aristotle to really start seeing the science behind these scientists. Now, the first scientist we're going to talk about is John Dalton. Now, you might remember John Dalton because he was the first person to say Democritus was correct. There is something called the atom. And not only that, but he stated that the atom can be, or people have said the analogy of his atom can be explained like a billiard ball. Now, I don't know if he actually said it's a billiard ball, but people explain that it's a solid sphere. So you could draw it as just a solid sphere. Then after Dalton came J.J. Thomson, and he took Dalton's idea about 100 years later and said there's something called electron. He used what we call a cathode ray tube and was able to deflect these particles, and thus he said there must be some electrons in this atom. And the analogy a lot of people use, there's 2 types. There's the plum pudding, or there's the raisin bun. Because his atom looks like Dalton's, but the whole atom itself is positive, but scattered around the atom are your negatively charged electrons. So they look like, in this case, plum puddings or raisins. After Thomson came Ernest Rutherford. Ernest Rutherford finally said, oh, I want to research this and found that there were not only electrons, but there is something called the nucleus. He did the gold foil experiment. And he thus said that the nucleus must have some dense particles, and he called them the protons. A lot of people can call this one, I call this one the egg yolk analogy because it looks like an egg yolk. Because what happened was that positive charge, which the proton is no longer scattered around the whole atom. It's now down in the middle of the atom. So if you had the atom, that positive charge is now in the middle. And those negative charges are still scattered around the atom, the nucleus in this case. Lastly, Niels Bohr, who was actually a student of Rutherford, and he studied using spectrums, using a spectroscope. He found that there is not only just electrons, but the electrons were in specific electron orbitals. And a lot of people call this the planetary model or the solar system model. And what happens here is your atom, it's no longer not just having electrons scattered around it, but electrons are scattered in orbits around the nucleus. So you're going to have electrons scattered around this nucleus now. So that's what he found was the case. So if you notice, each of these models built upon each other. You had Dalton, which was just a plain solid sphere. You had Thomson, which now started adding charges. You had Rutherford, which now talked about nucleus, and then lastly you have Bohr, which is now what you're talking about electron orbitals. So these models are great ways to explain the atom. Now how we think of the atom nowadays is actually a bit different, and that's actually coming up soon in this unit. Your homework for this section is page 142, number 1 to 11 odds. And just make sure if you ever have time to check this out, you can look at Carl Sagan, who was a famous scientist who had a show called Cosmos back in the day. He explained who Democritus was. You could check out Captain Planet's theme song with this link. And last but not least, you could check out Ernest Rutherford's gold foil experiment with this last YouTube link. As always, make sure you keep yourself safe and healthy, and I'll see you soon.